University. I've used him for 3 years, and I really had the pleasure of engaging with and learning from a junior scholar who was at the time just developing the work that they wanted to do in academia. And then I also want to point out in the room today, we have our current postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Ali Yildirim. So, for those of you curious about and thinking about, what work you can do in gender studies, Dr. Yildirim has a degree in feminist studies from the University of Minnesota. And because of the kind of program that we have, that we can have visiting scholars, we get a lot of different influences and engagements. These are two scholars I think you'll find will help us to think better in the area of disability studies. Right? Some of my students had not had the chance to think about what that might be as a field of study. I had the privilege of working with Dr. Waggoner and in my experience at University of Michigan learning about disability studies, but really having a chance to practice and engage with it further because of our program offering a visiting scholar position. So, okay, I'm going to read to you these scholars' impressive bios, and then we'll get started with Dr. Kim's presentation. Dr. Jina Kim is a scholar of feminist disability studies and queer of color critique. She is an associate professor of English and the study of women and gender and sexuality at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. Her new book, which we are very much celebrating today, congratulations, Care at the End of the World, Dreaming of Infrastructure in Crip-of-Color Writing, demonstrates how and why we need radical disability politics and aesthetics for navigating contemporary crises of care. Jina's work has appeared in Signs, Social Text, GLQ, American Quarterly, South Atlantic Quarterly, Disability Studies Quarterly, and the Asian American Literary Review. She is the recipient of multiple awards and fellowships, including the Career Enhancement Fellowship from the Institute for Citizens and Scholars and the Visiting Faculty Fellowship at Brown University's Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. In 2012, she received the Irving K. Zola Award for Emerging Scholars in Disability Studies. So you can see we get to hear from a groundbreaking scholar in this field. Likewise, Jessie Waggoner. Dr. Jessie Waggoner is an assistant professor in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies and English at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Before arriving at UW-Madison in 2020, Jessie was a postdoctoral fellow in WGSS, as I mentioned, where they taught UH's first Intro to Trans and Non-Binary Studies course. Hey. During this time, we also co-developed together the UH Critical Disability Studies Initiative. And we have a listserv for that if you want to email me and get on that to build community networks. Dr. Waggoner's work has been supported by grants from the NEH, the AAUW, the Schlesinger Library, and the Smith College Sophia Smith Collections. Their work has appeared in venues such as Signs, Feminist Studies, Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, Modern Fiction Studies, Journal of Modern Literature, AD Autobiography Studies, and Modernism, Modernity, among others. Their first book, Black, Crip, Modern, Race, Gender, and the Roots of Disability Consciousness, is forthcoming from New York University Press. From their series, Crip, New Directions in Disability Studies, in June 2026. And they are currently working on a second project, Queer Ableisms and the Persistence of Crip Queer Life, which explores both unique forms of ableism within queer and trans cultures and archival evidence of how disabled queer people have developed creative strategies of resistance. So I welcome Dr. Kim to the stage, and we thank you both for joining us.
I have a mic, but I don't. Is it on? Hello?
Is it okay? Almost. Keep talking. Hello? Hello?
Hello? Hello?
It's gonna go.
Hello?
Oh, it's just for the.
Oh, okay. Okay. Are we going to have a double mic?
Is it gonna cause a problem? Okay,
Okay.
great. I think you.
Okay. I can do double.
I don't want you to like.
Oh, I do need this for the slides.
Yeah, figure it out. Okay. Where are Jina Kim? Awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
You have what you need?
Yes.
Great.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome.
Hello. Such a pleasure to be here today. Thanks everyone for making time to be here this afternoon. It really means a lot to me. I want to extend a special thanks to Dr. Rachel Offie-Quinn for the invitation to speak. Annalise Lucio for coordinating the logistics. And of course to my dear friend, Dr. Jessie Waggoner for joining me here today. We're going to have a great conversation. So this QR code, if you take a photo of this, it'll bring you to an access copy of my talk in Google Docs so that you can follow along with me. It's kind of like a form of subtitles. And let me know when you all have gotten it. Okay, great. Okay. So I'm going to start off by saying that, does everyone have the QR code? I'm going to start off by saying that this is a wild time to be promoting a book. Okay. But nevertheless, I'm hoping that this book will offer us some conceptual tools to navigate the intensifying levels of infrastructural violence that have come to characterize our present moment. So my book, Care at the End of the World, broadly brings a disability lens to bear on women and queer of color writing and the afterlife of major U.S. welfare reform, which passed in 1996. So first and foremost, my book asks, how can disability justice, politics, and aesthetics provide imaginative blueprints for navigating contemporary crises of care, such as the ongoing privatization of life-sustaining resources, such as education, food, housing, and transit. And by privatization, I mean making these kinds of life-sustaining resources available to only those who can afford them. So just to give you a sense of how today is going to go, for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to talk about how this question pertains to my current book that just came out, and then I'm going to give you a little sneak preview of how this question is animating an emerging line of inquiry on the literary forms and methods of disabled and queer of color friendship. All right? So in my book, I situate these care crises of privatization within a much longer history of 1980s and 1990s anti-welfare policy, with welfare reform as my periodizing event. So major welfare reform, or the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, attempt to further establish the heterosexual nuclear family as the United States' primary social safety net. So this legislation began with the statement, marriage is the foundation of a successful society, a privatizing move that further absolved the state from accountability to its most vulnerable citizens. Most famously, it gutted the Aid for Families with Dependent Children Act program, turning it into temporary assistance for needy families, which was then marked by time limits and work requirements in exchange for receiving aid. In order to manufacture consent for these changes, welfare reforms advocates weaponized a strategy of pathological dependency. Okay. So here, they shamed women for being dependent on the government rather than a husband. Okay. And rather than authoring a standalone story, welfare reforms pundits generated a whole cast of characters, right? So who is dependent in an improper way, right? So there are figures such as the so-called welfare queen, the figure of the non-citizen immigrant, and the figure of the disabled non-worker. So far from a thing of the past, these figures continue to animate our national imagination. Implicitly racialized, feminized, and disabled, they conjure up the specter of needy populations draining the American public of its hard-earned resources. In this stingy and hateful imaginary, those who are most in need of care are often paradoxically understood to be the least deserving of it. So the method and framework that I introduce in this book, I call a Crip-of-Color critique, and I'm going to explain a little bit more what I mean by the term Crip shortly. So this framework turns to feminist, queer, and disabled writers of color in order to highlight alternate understandings of dependency and care in our post-welfare era. Okay, so first and foremost, this is a framework that demonstrates how theories and narratives of disability can meaningfully intervene into state-authored narratives about who deserves care. Okay. So that is, if the welfare queen, the non-citizen immigrant, and the disabled non-worker are all kind of brought together under this banner of pathological dependency, what happens if we no longer see dependency as a source or site of shame, right? Rather, what if we saw it as a potential site of solidarity between the populations most targeted by welfare reform? And this is a kind of coalitional move that this framework is trying to do. Feminist disability scholars are well practiced in this mode of recuperating dependency and care, and have long highlighted the webs of support and of interdependency that simply make life more possible. Rather than being a parasitic relationship abused by certain types of people, for us, feminist disability scholars, dependency becomes legible as a social bond that is vital to individual and collective well-being. Finally, a Crip-of-Color critique further highlights the life-giving structures of support envisioned by women and queer writers of color in the face of racialized resource deprivation. So looking to writers like Jesmyn Ward, Octavia Butler, Karate Yamashita, Aurora Levins-Morales, and Leah Lakshmi Pyapshna Samrasinghe, Care at the End of the World highlights how literary representations of infrastructure enable these writers to articulate a counter-discourse of dependency, one that engages the disabling effects of state austerity measures while envisioning a public and collective ethics of care. I'd like to take a moment to briefly explain here how I'm using the term infrastructure in the book, given that it is a key term. So in its most literal sense, as these images might suggest, right? So infrastructure refers to these kind of built material networks, you know, pipes, roads, wires, right, that organize life, right, that coordinate life, that both make live and let die. The term also refers to public services and institutions such as schools, hospitals, and welfare offices, which often travel under the term soft infrastructure. And then finally, I use the term to describe the support labor of care, service, and maintenance that is disproportionately performed by women and people of color, as well as the more informal networks that distribute resources in the absence of state assistance. So I'm thinking of infrastructure also as a form of support and care labor, right? So following this, each of my chapters examines a different infrastructural system. So the first chapter is kind of a general overview of the landscape of infrastructural divestment, and I'm engaging the figure of the welfare queen. Chapter 2 touches on sanitation. Chapter 3 touches on transportation and the figure of the non-citizen or undocumented immigrant. And then chapters 4 and the epilogue focus on the infrastructure of healthcare. Okay. So through looking at these different infrastructural narratives, I consider how they generate new perspectives on and pathways around the often punitive logics of public resource distribution, which weaponize the charge of dependency to argue that some people deserve less than others. Disability analysis always is my guiding light in mapping out these moments of refusal and rupture. In this book, then, disability is not only the name for a certain kind of physical or cognitive difference, right? It also names a practice of reinventing care and of dreaming of the kinds of infrastructure that we actually deserve. But before I go further, I just want to share a couple of definitions with you so that we all have a kind of shared vocabulary moving forward. So I talk about disability justice politics, right? So what do I mean by that? So disability justice is an intersectional framework of disability politics that was developed in the early 2000s by Bay Area performance group Citizen Valid. It's a framework that expands outward from the focus on legal reform that drove the disability rights movement, right? So disability justice activists, thinkers, practitioners often focus on the most vulnerable within disability communities for whom legal rights might not be accessible, right? And then finally, in distinction from the often single issue focus of disability rights, which really emphasized disability, didn't consider its intersections with other forms of identity, right? Disability justice is a framework that thinks about how ableism works alongside and through other systems of oppression, such as white supremacy, capitalism, colonialism, and heteropatriarchy. I also wanted to explain the term Crip, because that might also be a newish term for some of us in this room. So Crip is short for cripple, right? And it's a reclamation, right? It's a reclamation of a term that has typically been used to degrade disabled people, right? So when Crip is used by disability scholars and activists, it indicates a more politicized relationship to disability, right? It indicates that we're not just ascribing to this belief that disability is a problem that's best resolved by medical intervention or cure, right? We have a different kind of relationship to an understanding of disability. And then finally, like the term queer, right, Crip can also function as a verb, right? So you might have heard, the phrase to queer a text, right? You could also crip a text, in which disability becomes kind of like a reading practice or a lens, right? To think about how a text might either, reaffirm ableist understandings of the world or articulate a kind of a radical disability ethos, okay? So just so we have a shared vocabulary, that's disability, justice, and Crip. And I'm happy to take more questions on these terms when we get to the Q&A. So I want to talk now briefly about why I was so invested in this practice of dreaming of infrastructure, which is, of course, the book's subtitle, right? And to draw a bit from the book's epilogue, which is much more like personal narrative focused. Okay. And I also want to say that a lot of this book came out of a place of grief for losing my best friend while I was in the middle of turning the dissertation into the book, and so the epilogue kind of speaks to that grief. Okay. And this is a photo of me and my best friend when we were 17 in the college dorms, and this is a photo of her on the left. So, when my best friend was diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer in October of 2018, I found myself consumed by dreaming. More than any romantic partner, she was the person to whom I had anchored my life, the one who first modeled for me the art of queer-of-color survival. With her diagnosis, I both dreamed of and mourned the future we would never share. My dreams also contended with the lived reality of her illness and with the structures coordinating her medical care: the waiting room, the rehabilitation hospital, the social worker, the insurance labyrinth taking all her time and energy, her accumulating medical costs. They also contended with the troubling dynamic emerging between her and her primary caregiver / long-term romantic partner, who increasingly isolated her from other sources of care and support. So I won't get too deeply into this, just enough so that you can understand where my reading is going. But basically because of the cultural expectation that either a romantic partner or a family member will function as your main caregiver in the case of terminal illness or long-term disability, it's very easy for a significant amount of power and control to be concentrated in the hands of one person. And I will say this much now about their dynamic. Her partner's actions primarily took the form of social isolation and interpersonal control. We, her friends and family, could not acknowledge the fact that she was dying, or else we would be purged from her social circle. What's more, we were only allowed to care for her to the very limited degree allowed for by her partner, who withheld key information about her care protocol. Deep in my grief, I wanted so much more for her. From the sterile chamber of her hospital room, I remember feeling so much clear desire for a healthcare system that could recognize friendship as life connection, for ways to tell my friend she wasn't a burden, for other and more expansive structures of care to hold her in her final days. And yet, even under that regime of restriction, there were still moments of loving attachment. Sometimes there was even joy. Because, to borrow the words of M. Jackie Alexander, we could not afford to cease yearning for each other's company, even as so many forces conspired to make it otherwise. I remember a profound moment of connection at Piedmont Atlanta Hospital in a drab inpatient room that was all plastic and all beige. It was at Piedmont where I read her the essay After Peter, which was part of gay Korean-American writer Alexander Chi's stunning 2018 essay collection, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. When we were alone in her hospital room, I often felt compelled to read to her, even though this wasn't something we had ever done before. I'm not sure why I started doing this. In hindsight, I think I wanted to find some way to tell her how our love made it possible for me to live. I needed, however, to say this without breaking the vow of silence I had made implicitly to her and her partner, in which I could not acknowledge the possibility of her dying, even as she was doing so right before me. So I borrowed from the long-standing queer tradition of speaking in code. This time, the code was Chi's essay. After Peter is a requiem for his former lover, friend, and comrade, Peter D. Kelleran, who fought alongside Chi in the 1990s San Francisco gay activist scene, where they participated in ACT UP SF and Queer Nation. Like many other gay men of his generation, Peter died of HIV/AIDS, passing in May 1994 after years of protesting government inaction against the epidemic. I first came across this essay at a 2018 reading in Amherst Books, where I listened to Chi read it aloud, his eyes beaded with tears. Moved by this open display of grief, I bought his book. I did not know that 4 months later, the essay would speak to me in a different way. In many ways, After Peter was not a perfect analog for my particular experience of loss. Chi begins the story with an admission that he was, quote, a minor character in Peter's story, end quote, and was not among the first group of people notified of his passing. The two were also, for a brief span of time, romantically involved. It's true, too, that Peter's death from HIV/AIDS slots into queer history in a way that my friend's sudden diagnosis of brain cancer does not. And while After Peter reads in many ways like a portrait and loving homage to a single person, the character of Peter also functions as a portal to a particular time in Chi's life, when he was 22, a new arrival to San Francisco, and throwing himself into the heady world of direct action AIDS activism. At this time in San Francisco, he writes, it seemed that the world might either go up in flames or be restored in a healing past imagining. I think now, 20 years later, this feeling might always be true. Still, there were places in the essay with which I felt resonance. Like Peter, my friend was a kind of art prodigy, good at ceramics, drawing, design. We had met initially as art majors at Georgia's Governor's Honors Program, a state-funded summer camp for high school juniors and seniors. At the time of her diagnosis, she was designing textiles for major retailers, and one of her rugs had recently been featured in a Vogue photo spread. I had long given up on the idea of making a living from art, and I admired her fearless insistence on doing so. I admired many things about her, including but not limited to her fearlessness and utter self-possession, which remained as constant at the age of 34 as it did at 17. As a mixed-race Chicana teenager, she founded a chapter of the Gay-Straight Alliance at her majority-white conservative high school, serving as the chapter's president. I was also a teenage member of the GSA, but as an ally. It would take me many years to publicly claim my sexuality. Like Peter, who was listed among Chi's personal pantheon of heroes from that time, my friend inspired me to be an artist, to protest, to live as queerly, confidently, and as openly as I wanted. By reading After Peter aloud, I was able to say this to her, and many other things without risking entry into the territory of mourning. When I wanted to say, I'll miss you, I read, I can't help but long for Peter still, the sight of him, a star in my eye. When I wanted to say thank you, I read, in the end, I wonder if it is a mistake to think about what was lost, if it isn't better to think about what Peter gave me. When I wanted to tell her how she helped me find a way to exist freely, how her friendship blunted the sharp corners of my once unlivable world, I read to her Chi's paean to the gay men who should have been his elders, quote, the men I wanted to follow into the future are dead. Finding them had made me want to live, and I did. I do. I feel I owe them my survival. As we sat in the afterglow of the essay, tearful and stunned, I could feel the curtain between us momentarily part. She made me want to live. I owe her my survival. Queer of Color and Disability Justice Life Writing helped me tell her this. Chi's essay thus offered a safety net and a healthcare infrastructural landscape that would not let us love each other in the way we always had. It offered support and recognition in a context that does not always view friendship as a legitimate connection. And so, at the end of her life, I was dreaming of infrastructure. And now, in the middle of Trump 2.0, I am still dreaming. But as the feminist, queer, and Crip-of-Color literary pantheon has taught me, I'm not alone. There is in fact a storied tradition of infrastructural freedom dreaming, of reimagining what is and reaching toward what could be. While navigating the US landscape of infrastructural violence, I have also been held by feminist, queer, and disabled friends, colleagues, and comrades who helped me find a way to survive in academia and in life. Because of you all, I know that queer and disabled friendship makes me rich. I know we are most dangerous when we find each other. And I know we are most dangerous when we dream. Okay, so I'm now gonna transition into a preview of new work. This will be about 15 minutes, okay? And this section is titled At the End of the World, Let There Be You, on the politics and poetics of Crip-of-Color friendship. So since my book came out in April of 2025, the conditions for disabled survival in the United States have, to put it lightly, not improved. As reported by Mia Ives-Roulet and Casey Doherty of the Center for American Progress, history will show the first 6 months of the second Trump administration as an all-out war against disabled people. With the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in July 2025, came a 12% cut to Medicaid, alongside the nationwide implementation of work requirements as a prerequisite for Medicaid coverage, not to mention the bill's massive ballooning of the ICE budget. And I invite us to think about the relationship between cuts to Medicaid and the ballooning of the ICE budget here. Further, governmental mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic, with its shrinkage of public space for immunocompromised people, continues to intensify disabled isolation while minimizing our life chances. So to borrow a formulation by disability justice writer-activist Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasinha, this is a moment that feels truly apocalyptic, right? Things feel too much to bear. And then there's more to bear. And then there's more. Right? So in a time of apocalypse, abandonment, and isolation, I find myself returning time and again to the relational and literary forms envisioned by disabled, feminist, and queer-of-color writers attempting to bear the unbearable. More specifically, I'm increasingly curious about contemporary disabled and queer-of-color writing that cultivates interpersonal infrastructures beyond those of romantic and familial love. So following this, I am deepening my inquiry into the Crip-of-Color politics and aesthetics of friendship. So in particular, I'm becoming interested in feminist, queer, and disabled writers of color that mobilize friendship as a formal strategy, a knowledge-making project, and method of authorship in order to envision a more collaborative, horizontal, and diffuse distribution of our relational, caring, and creative labors, and particularly tilted towards those who are not often seen as worthy of our collective support. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that friendship is a silver bullet for the many crises of care, or a utopian form free of baggage or intimate harm. Indeed, friendship also names a terrain of disabled struggle, insofar as it is shaped and at times undone by the pressures of everything that prohibits disabled participation in collective life. Our fraying public health infrastructures, increasingly eugenic state policies, and the debilitating sensation of inhabiting the end of the world, or at least some version of it. It is within this apocalyptic context that I turn to the Black, queer, and disabled world of friendship cultivated by writer and spoken word performer Denez Smith and their 2020 poetry collection, Homie. Released just prior to the COVID-19 lockdown and the George Floyd protests that rocked Smith's hometown of Minneapolis, Homie is an emphatic, exclamation point forward collection of odes, elegies, and elegiac odes to the kinds of enlivening connections that give us reasons for living when the world otherwise seems empty of them. It is dedicated in part to the, quote, realist one, phonetic one, Andrew Thomas, a close friend that Smith lost to suicide. And as the elegiac ode might suggest, Homie is a collection equally punctuated by Black joy, wonder, and gratitude, as it is imbued with a mundane persistence of depression. Poems like Depression Food, I'm Going Back to Minnesota Where Sadness Makes Sense, and the poem Notes, which is an epistolary lyric addressed to suicide itself, gesture toward a life and community linked together, at least in part, by racial melancholia, a term coined by Shin Hee Han and David Ng to describe a sense of everyday shared grief in the context of white supremacy. Or, as Smith's close friend Cameron Awkward Rich once put it, all my friends are sad and bright. Present also are poems like Gay Cancer, that explore Smith's HIV-positive status in an antiretroviral era. 1996, I want to know, was also the year that combination therapies became available to those with healthcare access. Homie, then, is a collection on friendship concerned with the chronic, the persistent pull of racialized sadness and sickness that turns some of us into dust, but not before we find each other. I want then to linger on the collection's animating tension between friendship and depression, terms that at first glance feel like contradictions, right? So while depression often invites these kinds of associations with isolation, social withdrawal, and disassociation, I argue that Homie brings depression into the realm of the relational, exploring the kinds of Black, queer, and disabled social worlds forged within, not despite, depression's atomizing tendencies. In this way, I follow disability scholars M. Remy Yergo, Natalia Duong, and Cameron Awkward Rich, as well as queer studies scholar Ann Svetkovich, in reframing disability, depression, and neurodivergence as resources for reshaping what we think we know about social relations, and for disrupting the understanding of disabled bodies as isolated sites of damage. In the time that remains, I want to explore the shape and feeling of one of these worlds by way of the collection's concluding poem, the ode titled Acknowledgements. So I propose that Acknowledgements cultivates a Crip-of-Color lyric poetics of communal intimacy in order to position friendship, and specifically Black, queer, and disabled friendship, as a material and embodied means of bearing, at least for a moment, the apocalyptic now. So taken together with the aforementioned poem Notes, and I see these poems as paired through the paratextual genres of notes and acknowledgements. Acknowledgements generates the Black, disabled, and queer knowledge of what it means to be surrounded by death and live on. So here are the poem's beginning lines. I'm going to play a little video for you.
Just call it acknowledgements. Oh, and I'm gonna say one in between each of the things, so there's not numbers on the page. And if you ever seen a poet try to like count at the same time as they're like doing a poem, and they just say 17 3 times, and it's not intentional, yeah, it's not cute. So I'm gonna say one because I remember that. One. You say we have a bag of skins, the hard parts, I fade, dusted orange but hot. One. You say we can't go to the bar because you're taking your braids out. I come over, we watch Medea while we pull you from you. One, you make us tacos with the shells I like and you don't. One, I get too drunk at a party, you scoop my pizza from the sink with a solo cup. All that red. One, you in the morning, bong water, grin, wet chin. One, You in the lawless dark, laughing like a room of women laugh at a man who thinks his knowledge is knowledge. One, I text you and you say, I was about to text you, bitch. One, you cook pork chops the same way I do. Our families in another city go to the same church. One, you rolling a blunt, holding your son is a mecca. One, you invite me out for drag queens the night I thought to finally. One, you pulled over in Mississippi so I could walk a road my grandfather led on. One, you gave me a stone turtle. It held your palm scent for a week. One.
So after playing those lines, I also want to show you how they fall on the page. I'm also happy to share the entirety of this poem for people who want to listen to the entirety of the poem. So visually, these lines cluster in the middle, a center alignment that offers more space for them to gather and breathe. They are further linked together by circles that conjure up a multiplicity of associations. The O that signals the ode's direct address to an elevated other, the roundness of portals into other worlds, and even little worlds itself. The poem quickly establishes its template and rhythm. You save me. You save we. You make us. A formation in which the lyric I, so the me, right, is simultaneously the direct and indirect object of a plural you, with the distance between the one who is addressed and the poem's speaker consistently collapsing into a we and an us. At the level of the sentence, then, acknowledgments enacts the work of friendship as an intersubjective practice against self-possession, one that troubles the binary between interior and exterior and points to the loving contingency linking bodies and worlds. Notice, too, the bag of skins, the pulling of braids, and the pizza vomit, all of which name touch, waste, eating, and play as inroads into both the messianic and mundane space of everyday intimacy. And toward this mode of the messianic mundane, consider the opening words, you save me, with the verb save corresponding to both the me of the speaker and the half a bag of skins. I want to pause now on the poem's references to hair and vomit, famously named by psychoanalyst Julia Kristeva as hallmarks of abjection. Abjection being materials that provoke disgust and horror through the kind of confusing or confounding of bodily borders. In so doing, such materials present a threat to this fantasy of the whole and independent self, right? As well as to a social order built on this fantasy of bodily sovereignty. And this is a threat similarly posed by disabled bodies. And yet, in the lyric space of acknowledgments, encounters with the abject build relational worlds, which emerge from an intimacy with a porous, open, and non-sovereign body. Consider, too, a later line that reads, quote, your poop is news, your fart is news, your gross body, my favorite bomb, end quote. So if disability poetics, as Jim Ferris proposes, describes a poetic practice that engages atypical or non-normative bodies, then I view Smith's abject imagery as also indicative of a Crip-of-Color poetic sensibility, one in which the vulnerable leaking body is not denied or disavowed, but rather revered as an unexpected portal to pleasurable connection. These moments of embodied connection, both sacred and ordinary, are what enable this poem's speaker to stay present on this earth. Quote, you invite me out for drag queens on the nights I think of finally. Similarly, the poem's verbs stay suspended in the present tense, modeling a mode of temporality that literary scholar Sharon Cameron has termed lyric time. As opposed to the novel or narrative, which connects isolated moments of time to create a story multiply peopled and framed by a social context, Cameron argues that the lyric voice speaks out of a single moment in time, producing an experience of time as a still life in which moments are not consecutive, but rather heaped or layered. Or, as Cameron Awkward-Rich explains, in the simple present of the lyric, moments do not unfold, but are layered on top of each other in a perpetual now. In this way, the present, or at least some parts of it, becomes legible in the poem as a felt resource for the support of Black, queer, and disabled life worlds. Indeed, Homie is poetry of the present. After all, the first word of the collection is today. And even as the here and now is a prison house for queers, to quote Jose Esteban Munoz, Smith's poem shows us what might turn the prison into rain, at least for a brief moment. Seeing drag queens, watching Tyler Perry's Medea, laughing at a man who thinks his knowledge is knowledge. As acknowledgement suggests, embedded within the toxic present are minor instances of salvation that do the vital work of intergenerational reproduction. That is, the work of making and holding each other when little else will. This is not, however, to oversell the present as a place of optimism. These Black, queer, and disabled relational worlds are often not durable, and the perpetual now of lyric time, with its lack of duration, sequence, and longevity, underscores for me this sense of fragility. So as much as minoritarian friendship provides some amount of support in an infrastructurally bereft world, it is also, as I mentioned above, a terrain of struggle. So I'm going to go ahead and skip to my concluding paragraph. I have some material about Smith's process for writing this poem, which was a crowdsourced process where they posted on Facebook the prompt, "When did you know your best friend was your best friend? Go." And they developed some of these lines from the responses to that prompt. I could talk more about it in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead. So finally, the genre of apocalypse, like the poem Acknowledgements, similarly functions as a knowledge-making project. From the Greek word apokalypsis, meaning to reveal, apocalypse describes the unveiling of prophetic or heavenly knowledge, in addition to its connotations with cataclysmic destruction, messianic liberation, and the ending of some kind of world. With this in mind, I want to bring us to the concluding lines of Smith's poem and to the end of my talk. The concluding lines are, "At the end of the world, let there be you, my world." Incidentally, I also cited this excerpt in the acknowledgements for my first book. And you can see here that I also thank my cats. So these lines capture a kind of reverse Genesis, a book of revelations that is also at once a myth of origin. Embedded within this world's end is another beginning, with the line, "Let there be you," evoking the divine call for illumination. Let there be light. Against understandings of apocalypse as an end point, right, the end of the world, Acknowledgements frames the end of the world in terms of suspension, recursion, and circularity, right? We're suspended, right? There's not a definitive end. We're suspended in a kind of euphoria. Mirroring poems by two of Smith's close friends, Cameron Awkward-Rich's Cento Between the Beginning and the End, and fellow Dark Noise Collective member Franny Choi's The World Keeps Ending and the World Goes On. Not a definitive break between this life and the next, the apocalypse within Smith's poem instead reveals the divine knowledge of salvation as something multi-sided, relational, and embedded within the everyday. Quote, "You holding your son, rolling a blunt, is a Mecca," end quote. Even surrounded by death, here is knowledge of how to persist, by knowing that sadness, sickness, and the gross body can nonetheless usher in an expansive relationality, knowing that love is both messianic and ordinary, And knowing that gestures like saving half a bag of skins, though seemingly minor, can nonetheless offer portals to Black, queer, and disabled worlds of aliveness, brimming and present in the one that we currently inhabit. Thank you.
Going to just switch over to a conversational format so that Dr. Waggoner can ask some pointed questions.
Can y'all hear me?
It didn't.
Now, can y'all hear me? Just testing it out here. Yeah, okay, great, yeah. Hi everyone, it's really incredible to be back here. And I had the pleasure of spending 3 years in Houston with some really, really incredible folks. And I could talk forever about how impactful that time was for me. But I want to ask you some questions. And yeah, I want to talk about femmes.
Yes.
Okay. We have a shared love of queer femme culture.
Yes.
Right? And femmes and feminized people of color are central
Yes.
to your work.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
We've had some great conversations about femme, not just as a visual presentation,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
But as a practice,
Yes.
as a way of relating to the world.
Yes.
So I was just wondering if you wanted to talk more about that.
Yeah. That's a great question. Lauren, my best friend, was once described as more femme than Mariah Carey, which she said was actually an impossibility, but you know, she'll take it. Yeah, I mean, the category of femme shows up a lot. I mentioned disability justice activist Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasinha, who wrote this amazing poem called Femme Shark Manifesto, and you know, reclaims femme as a queer relationship to gender and to femininity, right? They understand femme as intention, right? This kind of intentional inhabiting, this politicized inhabiting of femininity, which is so often denigrated, right? Or seen as unserious or apolitical, right? And a lot of their framework of care work, which was so influential to this book, is all about the kind of organizing labor that femmes do, like providing emotional support for people, coordinating rides, making food for people, right? Is often not seen as kind of legitimate of organizing labor as putting on a protest, like going to marches, right? But you know, they're arguing that this is actually life-changing, world-making labor. Care labor is legitimate activist and organizing labor. And so that understanding of care work really impacts the way I talk about care in this book. I also think that gender is often a relationship to care labor, right? So like, who among us is interpolated or seen as someone who should be providing care for people, right? And who is seen as someone who deserves all the care from people, right? Oftentimes this relationship to care labor, whether you're seen as someone who should do it or if you're seen as someone who deserves it, is a relationship to gender, right? Like, I think that we're seeing the kind of attempt to recreate a world in which, you know, white straight men get all the care, right? But it's not named or seen as such, right? So to me, femme is a labor practice, right? And when I talk about care in the book's introduction, which I know some of you read, I talk about I talk about care under the conditions of racial capitalism, right? And the fact that we're living in this care crisis where there's this two-tiered system of social reproduction where, you know, those who can outsource care labor do it, right? And only like the most resourced families are able to have adequate care because they can afford it, right? To go back to this question of privatization. So I'm going to stop my answer there because I want us to have more time for other questions. But thank you so much for that.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. And in that event, I do also want to talk about gross bodies.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And with regards to your work in general and also the whole collection that you were writing about, you know, bodily functions as disabled queer of color poetics.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
A big theme in your work, acknowledging the labor of those who engage with excrement, right, as well, from care laborers to sanitation workers.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to open some space to hear you talk about, you know, why that feels central. Also, like, why it feels pleasurable, if you want to talk more about that as well.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in disability politics of abjection, right? So, you know, abjection, again, is like, it's poop, it's hair, it's vomit, right? It's like any reminder that your body has, how do I put it, orifices, right? That we're not just this, like, self-contained, fully whole body, right? And, you know, disability scholars have talked about how disabled bodies are avatars of abjection because they provoke anxiety, right, about the body being kind of like open and leaky and vulnerable, right? And, you know, in the psychoanalytic literature, the abject is often theorized as a threat to the social. But in disability politics, it's really kind of reimagined and reclaimed as, you know, Cheryl Marie Wade has this great essay where she talks about needing bathroom assistance, right? And she's just like really frank and straightforward about it, right? It's not like, you know, over dramatized or anything. She's just like very matter of fact, right? Which I think allows us to have a different relationship to our bodies, right? In, you know, in distinction from the kind of shame-filled relation to our bodies that abjection as threat might pose, right? So I'm really interested in thinking about how, like, disability politics of the gross body is part of this kind of counter discourse of dependency, right? Where we're like, all our bodies need care, we all need assistance to live, right? This is not shameful. So that's how I'm thinking about abjection and the gross body throughout my work. Thank you for that.
Thank you. And do I have time for one more question? And then we can sort of bring in the room. I'm going to expand out a little bit and ask you about teaching, about pedagogy. And I've been reflecting while I'm here, or, you know, coming back, during the time that I was at University of Houston, I was going pretty hard in terms of accessible pedagogy and trying to sort of like spread the word, right? As like a collection of practices, as we do. While also, as things got even more challenging, if possible, in this world, thinking about the ways in which I was also creating this like politics of perfection around access, and, you know, trying to reinforce to myself and others that access is a process, that it's not disability culture to be perfect, right? And that especially like feminized educators, educators of color, like particularly feel those pressures, right? Of perfectionism. And so I was just wondering if you wanted to like reflect on access labor in the classroom, how your practices have changed or shaped, and also how are you kind of taking your own access into account too as an educator?
Yeah, that's a great question. me and this other disability scholar, Leslie Fry, were talking about writing a piece called Access Work is Work. Access work being, you know, the important work of making sure that PDFs are like screen reader accessible, right? That the videos have captions, right? That that there's like ASL interpreters, right? Kind of all this kind of invisible behind the scenes labor to make sure that your class materials can be accessible by as broad a range of students as possible. Now, I also try to do the access best practices, right? I take a universal design approach to my classes, but it is a lot of work. It's a ton of work, and one conclusion I've come to is that it can't just be the work of one person, right? Access is something that actually needs to be institutionally supported. In the times I've been able to have like a classroom assistant or any kind of access team in my classes, I've applied for funds for that, I've gotten them. It's just been so much easier, right? Because we live in this context where there's this model of access where it's like handed down or bequeathed to the student from the individual professor, right? And it's also incumbent upon the student to make certain kinds of access requests. And we think about like, who are the students who feel empowered to make those requests and who are not, right? So I think universal design goes a long way in combating that. But yeah, I mean, access has to be a collaborative and ongoing effort. You know, I teach Leah's essay Care Webs in my disability studies classes, and then I ask them, you know, how can we create a care web to support each other in this classroom, right? Like, how can the work of access be more distributed among the participants of this classroom so that everyone does a little bit of a lift, right? So that's one way I've approached it. Another way I've approached this is, you know, access requests are often made of like disabled faculty, right? And oftentimes we have less capacity, right, to honor these requests than other faculty. So I've tried to implement my own boundaries in terms of access requests in a way that I hope is still fair and just. So for example, I have a kind of blanket extension policy, right, where I give all students like 5 days worth of extensions if they need them. If they need to take more time, I try not to penalize them, right? But that can often create issues for me in terms of my grading. It's just so much harder to like, you know, I have to set aside blocks of time for grading. If I get papers in drips and drabs, that kind of doesn't help. So one way I've tried to, you know, honor my own capacity is I say, you know, you can have extensions, but if your paper is submitted over a week after the original due date, I say, I'll give you a grade, but I'm not going to give you feedback, right? And that's just a way for me to honor the access request while also honoring my own personal limitations, because we are also allowed to have those, right? So yeah, I mean, this is an ongoing, evolving practice, right, as access is.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love that. Thank you so much. And I think that's such a wonderful example of self-accommodation.
Mm-hmm.
Like I like to start my classes by saying, like, we all have access needs whether we know it or not,
Yeah.
whether they're documented or not. And I think that what you're talking about in terms of making that access more collective absolutely reinforces that, not just the folks who might have the resources, economic or otherwise, to sort of navigate the bureaucracy of like the disability determination process.
Right.
This is a much more inclusive practice for that. So at this time, we would love to hear from you.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to run the mic.
Maybe people could come up.
Yeah.
And use the
Or,
mic
yeah.
and be,
Yeah, whichever.
that way you can stay there.
Hello everybody, my name is Sexuality, and I had a question for Dr. Yeah. Wait, no, I didn't Dr. So I wanted to revert back to art board. I saw that you used her, one of her articles and on different pieces and what you wrote. And I read what you wrote. You stated that caring. I'll talk a little louder. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Can everybody hear me? Loud. A little louder. Okay, closer. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is in fact the act of political warfare. How do we extend our idea of political resistance against harmful stereotypes, such as wear-filled creams, but instead normalize the inclusion of care products and services and welfare support packages for people with disabilities, specifically marginalized groups?
Can I see the question written out?
Yes.
Okay.
If you want to read it out loud.
Yes.
Wait,
Okay, yeah. Okay, so this is idea of political resistance against harmful stereotypes. Yeah, normalize the inclusion of care products and services and welfare support packages. Yes, great. So, yeah, I mean, I would say in terms of like combating harmful stereotypes, like the welfare queen, right, which is an implicitly like racialized stereotype, right? It's really demonizing low-income single mothers who are implicitly like of color, right? And part of what my book is trying to do is to really think about like what are we demonizing when we demonize like the welfare mother, right? So why, like, what is wrong with being a single mother, right? What is wrong about needing government assistance, right? And then also to think about, you know, when the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program was initially created in 1935, it was called the Aid to Dependent Children back then. It was mostly associated with white widowed women, right? And then it was seen as necessary for those women, right? Widowhood was seen as like a legitimate reason for needing assistance. But as soon as, you know, there was expanded access to state assistance and to welfare, then we see the demonization of like improper mothers, right? And so it's really clear what's happening here, right? So like the demonization is a form of, it's a form of racism, misogynoir, and the language of dependency is being used to enact that racism and misogynoir, right? In a context where explicit racism would be less acceptable. Right? So part of what my book is trying to do is to say all the reasons you're demonizing the welfare queen are actually not sources of shame, right? We actually have to think about what we think of as like proper forms of dependency, right? Like husbands are often dependent on the labor of their wives, right? But that's not seen as bad. Right? That's just seen as the natural order of things, right? But as soon as a single or poor mother has to turn to government or state assistance, that's seen as bad dependency, right? And we as disability scholars are just like, what is that logic? Like, why would you consider this form of dependency bad and this form of dependency acceptable or even normalized, right? And I mean, it's a means of dismantling the welfare state, dismantling this idea that states should be accountable to their people. But also, you know, part of the book is questioning, like, whether the welfare state as it currently exists is necessarily the full solution, right? Because, you know, Black feminists have talked about how the administration of welfare required a lot of surveillance, right, by agents of the state, like people coming into women's houses and making sure that they didn't live with a man, right? Or else it would be kicked off the rolls, right? So, you know, I don't have any kind of definitive answer in this book, right? But I want us to, you know, think about broadly, like, what are the kinds of infrastructure, the kinds of forms of welfare and assistance that we actually want? What would those actually look like, right? And to not be kind of hemmed in by the conditions of the present, right? And to just kind of like let our imaginations run a little wild, which is why I turn to literature and poetry, right? Because I think this is a place where that can actually happen. So, yeah.
Hello, Dr. Kim.
Hello.
I have a question for you. And
Yes.
it's a little.
Speak up a little.
Oh,
Yeah.
can y'all hear me?
Now.
Okay. I just want to ask. The work that you do covers a lot of topics that in this day and age are very difficult to do a lot of research and work on.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, how do you deal with the anger that comes up when you do your work?
Yes.
And difficult emotions while doing the research that you do? And do you believe that anger is politicized in disability studies or in disabled bodies in general?
Yeah, yes. Yes, that's a great question. Both great questions. Excellent. Yeah, I mean, I think that an essay that really helps me, going back to Audre Lorde, is Audre Lorde's The Uses of Anger, right? And yeah, like thinking of anger as something that can be generative and disabled rage as generative, right? And certainly I'm very angry about what is happening and about you know, these programs and departments that we've spent so much time building and fighting for just being like slashed and cut. One of the things that helps me is just being in places like this, right? And in connecting with my friends and colleagues and comrades who are in the fight with me. And to also know that even if, you know, our federal government is totally going to slash women's and gender studies, slash ethnic studies, it doesn't mean that we're not going to still be doing the work. We're still going to be doing the work, right? It may not be institutionally supported in the same way, but, you know, I'm like, do I turn my garage into a feminist classroom? I am willing to do that, you know? And I also take a lot of inspiration from the feminist Barbara Ransby, who was talking about what we did before the establishment of women's and gender studies programs and ethnic studies, right? We had communiversities, right? We had alternative classrooms, right? We found ways to build and circulate this knowledge in ways that were not supported by institutions. And this knowledge has always been provisional. It's always been under risk. We've always had to fight for it, right? And I'm just like, what these states are trying to do is actually impossible. There's no way they can completely cut feminist and anti-racist organizing and education. Like, we're gonna find another way to do this, right? So I am an optimist, so that's part of where my hope is coming from. But I would say being in this room is really helpful, and just knowing that, you know, making connections and just remembering who we are, who are, you know, having contacts with people, to just know that, like, if things continue to go the way they go, we're gonna build alternative networks. It's already happening. So what they're trying to do is actually impossible, and they've already failed. So that's what helps me sleep through the night. Yeah.
Are we on time, Dr. Kim?
I think since we started a little late, we can take a few more
sure.
minutes. If people have somewhere they need to be, they should certainly.
Yeah, if you need to be somewhere else, I will release you, but I'm happy to, not that I had that that power to begin with, but we're also happy to continue answering questions or to have one-on-ones.
Let's take
So,
two more
Okay.
live, and then we can kind of wrap. What? Yeah, there's one here, video, and then.
Hi, my name's Peniel. So my main question was mainly going over your second comment.
Yes.
And it mainly went over as friendship as a strategy.
Yes.
All right. And so when you say friendship as a strategy, what exactly do you mean by that? Right? Because like we all have different ideas of what a real friend is. So
Yes.
Toxic, etc. So like when it comes down to friendship, like how would you break that down? What's your ideal?
Yeah.
Your ideal friendship.
Yes. Yes. That's a great. I mean, these are all incredible questions. So when I talk about friendship as a strategy, I'm talking about it specifically in the context of like disabled people loving each other, queer and people of color loving each other, right? And I'm thinking about it in terms of sharing survival strategies, right? Friendship is a way that we share strategies about how to navigate this world, right? Amani Barbarin, who goes by the TikTok handle Crutches and Spice, had this recent video about how important it is to have disabled friendships in navigating like doctor's offices and doctor's appointments, right? Crowdsourcing your strategies for how to navigate the world, right? So I'm thinking of friendship as a way where we crowdsource survival strategies, and I'm also thinking about it as a way of thinking about care much more expansively. So when we think about care, we mostly think about like mom and child, right? Or we think about a romantic partner to whom we give care, right? And that's very like, it's very focused and concentrated on one person, right? But I think that friendship for me is not only a description of a relationship, it's also an invitation to think of the many ways we might distribute and share care, right? That are not just about our blood family, right? Not just about our children or about our romantic partner, but about giving our care to the world, right? So those are two ways that I'm thinking about friendship as strategy. And thank you for that question.
I've been recently thinking a lot about, in terms of disability activism, what does it mean to really be a disability activist, especially in terms of like, because my grandma has Alzheimer's, and it's really late stage. You talk to her, you could be a complete stranger, she'd tell you she loves you and stuff like that, right? And I'm seeing the way like my family's handling it, and their forms of advocating for her needs, and especially in a hospital setting.
Yeah.
I don't want to say what they're doing is wrong.
Yeah.
But I'm like, I feel like that there is definitely like, maybe not the right way to advocate for someone who can't advocate for themselves, but maybe a better way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's a great question. What does disability organizing and activism look like in the context of elder care, right? Because there's so much overlap, right? Our elder care system is pretty messed up. It's minimal, right? Whatever care we do have is super expensive, right? And I don't know how your family is navigating this, but I think that we all have internalized ableism, right? We all grew up in a culture where there is kind of like contempt for the elderly, right? And so sometimes I think that even with our own best intentions, that can come out when we're navigating a care facility, right? So, I mean, I think that like it might be interesting to, you know, ask questions about maybe some of the assumptions they're making, about perhaps, you know, what it means to be elderly and disabled. I also am like kind of grappling with this question of like, how do you advocate for someone who can't advocate for themselves? And I want to recommend to you the work of Haley Yoshizaki Gibbons, who talks about, and I can write down that name for you later if you would like, but she writes about her time doing field work in nursing homes for elderly patients with dementia, right? And she talks about how their time is so strictly managed, right? They're under a lot of surveillance. One piece of her work that really struck me, a lot of it struck me, but she describes how, you know, these elderly women often inhabit like kind of alternate realities, right? And she's like, what would it mean to not struggle against that reality, right? But to actually kind of take it seriously as a form of care and to respond to them in a way that says, okay, this is the reality you're experiencing. So instead of trying to make you come into my form of reality, I'm going to join you where you are, right? And I just thought that was so beautiful, right? The way she writes about that, the way she describes that. So I would say that that could be like kind of one potential inroad. Like, what would it mean to actually take what, you know, elderly women with Alzheimer's, you know, what would it mean to take them seriously, right? And whatever that means in your context. While also, I mean, understanding that like maybe some of your family's reactions come from the soup of internalized ableism we're all swimming in, right? Jessie, do you want to add to that?
That was
at
exactly,
all?
I was going to recommend Haley's work.
Yes, yeah. I think this person is.
Two questions left. I'm surprised that yours.
Go ahead.
I was understanding. I was wondering, most of you, from what I read from both your works, I guess both Dr. Waggoner and Kim, but I noticed that your works, it was mostly regards to more visible disabilities. Obviously, you address the more hard to see ones like depression, but I was just wondering how those more invisible disabilities like depression or, for example, ADHD, how we should navigate this disability activism when people don't see us and don't recognize us.
Great. Do you want to speak to that at all?
I couldn't hear it.
Yeah, so the question was about, you know, disabilities that are not visible, right? So like ADHD or depression, right? So how do we navigate disability organizing around invisible disabilities? Would you say that's an accurate summary?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, we've also been thinking more about those terms and thinking about whether like apparent and less apparent might be useful because it's such a spectrum in terms of what can be apparent when someone is experiencing like neurodivergence or is identifying neurodivergent. I mean, the first thing is finding your people, right? And part of my journey as someone who was raised as a girl was not recognizing all of the ways in which high masking was not serving me, right? Someone who was like socialized as a Southern femme, right? And the process of unmasking can take such a long time, especially for people who are raised as girls, right? And so I have become a little bit obnoxious about stating up front as sort of a hello to someone. It's just like, hello, and also I am neurodivergent, so if my communications are X, Y, or Z to you, that is not personal, right? And what happens in those interactions is that usually folks feel comfortable to start disclosing where they're at, right? And so to the point that someone feels like they can be vulnerable, which I think is indeed a privilege in and of itself, I think there are just so many more of us, right, than we would ever think.
Yeah.
And I think it takes being loud about it,
Yeah.
right? Being obnoxious about it.
Yeah.
Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, in part because, you know, a lot of early disability studies really focused on like visible or perceptible disabilities, right? So like mobility impairments, I guess deafness is not always visible, but you know, deafness, blindness, etc. And so I think some of the work that me and Dr. Waggoner are trying to do is to expand what counts as disability, right? What we think of as disability. And along with that, you know, what it means to be political around disability, right? You are legitimate, right? Like you are valid, right? Even if other people don't see your disability or, you know, see, you know, I don't know, I think, you know, I also have ADHD and I've been perceived as like hyper-able, right? And a lot of my struggles have been invisible, right? So yeah, just, I think we're still on this road, right, of kind of expanding further what disability means, right? Explaining to people that just because you can't see someone's disability doesn't mean that they don't have one, right? And I just want to echo Dr. Waggoner in finding your people, right? Finding community, processing like microaggressions with your people, right? So yeah, I think I'll pause there.
I'll recommend
Yes.
something.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Ellen Samuels, Dr. Ellen Samuels has a piece on invisible disability and the limits of coming out discourse and the ways in which folks with less apparent disabilities have to come out over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
I highly recommend it. It's a really beautiful piece.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if you would like to, okay, share 2 comments. We're going to wrap, and then if you'd like to come up and introduce yourself. Or we have to.
I just wanted to make sure our folks who joined us virtually got a little bit of attention, and just bring to your attention that some things that really resonated, including the idea of that being a labor practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I love this particular quote or this particular comment, which was, to me, care is highly concentrated without the experience I have. So I just wanted to have those things out.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Just with regards to finding your people, I don't know if you know the Disabled Foods Organization. So just something to look up.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Dr. Singh. That's it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Come up and introduce yourself. We'd love to hear you.
That's my friend Rita.
Great. Oh my God, you are great. Oh. Should I? Thank you, everyone. Hi. Would you like to come up here? We can come down.
Thank y'all for.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming.